In February 2024, former President Donald Trump publicly questioned whether the United States should defend NATO allies that failed to meet their defense spending commitments in the event of a Russian incursion. The justification was not ideological or rhetorical, but transactional. Alliance protection, Trump suggested, could no longer be assumed as automatic without reciprocal financial contribution. The Biden administration reaffirmed America's commitment to Article 5, yet the episode passed without sustained diplomatic crisis. A decade earlier, such statements from a former U.S. president and leading presidential contender would have triggered panic inside the alliance. By the mid-2020s, they were absorbed with limited reaction. This was not a controversy about Donald Trump as an individual, nor about a single election cycle. It was a signal that the strategic architecture governing the Western world since 1949 is no longer treated as untouchable. The assumption that American protection is unconditional has begun to erode, not in rhetoric, but in policy language. This is not a question that can be answered with sentiment, shared values, or historical memory. It must be answered by examining incentives, dependencies, and the arithmetic of who pays, who benefits, and who has quietly structured their security around the assumption that America will always say yes. NATO was created to solve a specific problem. In 1949, the Soviet Union possessed overwhelming conventional forces in Central Europe and political control over much of the continent. The United States faced a choice between allowing Western Europe to fall under Soviet influence or extending a security guarantee that would deter expansion without requiring permanent occupation. Article 5 was not designed as a blank check. It was a tripwire. American forces stationed in Europe ensured that any Soviet invasion would immediately trigger U.S. involvement, removing the possibility of miscalculation. That bargain rested on two assumptions. First, that Europe would rebuild its own military capacity and gradually reduce dependence on American power. Second, that the Soviet threat was justified the expense. Secretary of State Dean Acheson testified in 1949 that NATO was a temporary arrangement intended to give Europe time to recover. In the early 1950s, U.S. defense spending exceeded 14% of GDP because the threat was existential and visible. Neither assumption survived the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Red Army dissolved. The Warsaw Pact disappeared. Russia today has an economy smaller than Italy's and a population in decline. Its military, though dangerous, has struggled to decisively defeat Ukraine, a country with a fraction of NATO's combined economic output. Europe, by contrast, is wealthy, technologically advanced, and home to more than 440 million people. NATO did not dissolve when its adversary vanished. It expanded. Membership grew from 16 states in 1991 to 32 by 2024, extending American security guarantees to countries whose defense capabilities are limited and whose threats are regional rather than existential to American security. Estonia, a nation of 1.3 million people, now carries the same formal protection as France or the United Kingdom. This expansion fundamentally altered the nature of the American commitment. The United States assumed responsibility for defending an ever larger perimeter, while European members increasingly structured their budgets around the assumption that this commitment was permanent. The imbalance is measurable. In 2024, the United States spent roughly $916 billion on defense, approximately 3.4% of GDP. NATO's European members collectively spent around $380 billion, under 2% of their combined GDP. Of the alliance's 32 members, a majority failed to meet the 2% spending target reaffirmed in 2014 after Russia's annexation of Crimea. Germany illustrates the dynamic clearly. As Europe's largest economy, with a GDP exceeding $4 trillion, Germany spent years allocating barely 1.4% of GDP to defense. By multiple assessments, its military lacked readiness, equipment, and deployable forces. This posture was not irrational. Why sustain a costly military when the United States provides a nuclear umbrella, forward-deployed troops, and an explicit commitment to treat German territory as American territory? This logic applies across the alliance. European governments devote far more of their budgets to social welfare than to defense, while American taxpayers finance the security environment that makes this choice viable. The asymmetry is not accidental. It is the predictable result of incentives created by an American guarantee perceived as irrevocable. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was described as a wake-up call for Europe. Defense spending increased modestly, and new procurement plans were announced. But the war revealed the depth of European dependence. Ammunition stockpiles were insufficient. Industrial capacity was limited. European defense industries could not sustain prolonged, high-intensity conflict without American logistics, intelligence, and production. Even against a Russia far weaker than the Soviet Union, Europe could not carry the burden alone. The rational response would have been rapid, large-scale rearmament. Instead, most governments moved incrementally, relying on American aid to fill the gap. This was not a failure of values. It was recognition of a system in which American credibility, not European capability, ultimately underwrites deterrence. This creates what can be called a credibility trap. American policymakers argue that NATO must be maintained regardless of European behavior, because withdrawal would destabilize global order. European governments understand this logic and act accordingly. They minimize costs, knowing that Washington cannot easily exit without incurring greater strategic damage. The result is a structure that punishes the guarantor and rewards the dependent. The strongest case for remaining in NATO is not idealism, but structure. When the United States withdrew from Europe after World War I, the continent fractured into competing powers, rearmament spirals, and eventually war. After World War II, sustained American engagement coincided with the longest period of great power peace in Europe's modern history. An American exit would not produce a neutral, unified Europe. It would likely produce a fragmented one. Germany would face pressure to rearm independently. France and the United Kingdom would expand nuclear capabilities. Eastern European states would seek their own deterrence. Such a Europe would be less stable, less predictable, and ultimately more dangerous to American interests than the current system. The implications would extend beyond Europe. If American security guarantees are seen as conditional or reversible, allies in Asia will draw conclusions. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan would reassess their reliance on U.S. commitments. Proliferation risks would rise. China would gain leverage over states seeking alternative security arrangements. From this perspective, NATO is not charity. It is the price of preventing a fragmented Eurasia dominated by rival spheres of influence. The costs are significant, but proponents argue they are lower than the cost of dismantling the system that supports American trade, influence, and financial dominance. The strongest argument for leaving NATO is not isolationism, it is sustainability. The United States now underwrites security commitments across Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and the Middle East simultaneously. It maintains hundreds of overseas installations and provides strategic capabilities allies cannot replicate. This posture was designed for a world in which the U.S. economy dominated globally and rivals were limited. That world no longer exists. The United States now represents roughly a quarter of global GDP. China is a peer competitor with vast industrial capacity. American defense production has atrophied. At the same time, national debt exceeds $36 trillion, and domestic political support for indefinite overseas commitments is eroding. Every dollar devoted to European defense is a dollar not devoted to deterring China in the Pacific, where the most consequential long-term challenge resides. Europe, collectively wealthier than the United States, is capable of defending itself. Its failure to do so reflects choice, not incapacity. From this view, withdrawal is not abandonment, it is accountability. Ending the subsidy would force Europe to confront realities long deferred. Rearmament would become unavoidable. American resources could be concentrated where they matter most. If the United States left NATO, the risks would be substantial. Europe would rearm unevenly. Proliferation pressures would rise. Russia would test boundaries. China would exploit uncertainty. American credibility would be questioned globally. These outcomes are not speculative. They follow rational incentives. If the United States stays, different risks emerge. Overextension deepens. Free riding persists in modified form. Fiscal and political strain increases. The alliance remains intact, but increasingly fragile, sustained by American credibility rather than shared burden. There is no clean answer. Leaving risks accelerating disorder. Staying risks locking the United States into commitments it may not be able to sustain indefinitely. The era in which American power was sufficient to guarantee everyone's security is ending. The question is not whether NATO once worked, but whether it can adapt before the assumptions beneath it collapse. The decision will define not only the future of the alliance, but the shape of American power in a world that no longer resembles the one in which NATO was born.